Thank you very much. It's great to see full room on the third day of the conference. And we have a very interesting conversation for the next 50 minutes. So it will be a short conversation. So we'll try to be very much to the point because we will have 5 very interesting speakers. The Croatian foreign minister will join us in a few minutes because he still has the bilateral. But the topic of today's discussion is Eastern Promise, the power shifts in the EU. It sounds a little bit weird because we traveled so much far east from Europe to talk about Eastern Promise of the EU and the power shifts in the EU. But anyway, we have a very distinguished and interesting panel here. So let me welcome Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Slovak Republic, Mr. Rastislav Káčer. Mr. Foreign Minister of Croatia will join us in a few minutes. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament in India. Alica Kizekova, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of International Relations in Czech Republic, and Teresa Fallon, Director of the Center for Russia, Europe and Asian Studies in Belgium. A year ago, when the war broke out on the 24th of February 22, the general expectation of many analysts was that Ukraine will only be able to defend itself for a few days. Many expected that the reaction of Europe will be very strong in words, but as many times in the past, in 2008 or 2014, slow, non-decisive, and basically harmless in actions. Russians have seen Europe a year ago as politically weak, divided, and not ready to agree on the decisive steps. The Russian calculation 1 year back was that the geopolitical timing was just right to attack Ukraine. There was a vacuum after a long Merkel era in Germany, a weakened Franco-German motor, new German chancellor, a US president that prefers dialogue over conflict, British that are already out from the EU, and they've seen the Ukrainian president as a comedian from Moscow. So they thought that we have all prerequisites to make a decisive action and go to Ukraine. But what Russians did not count on was not only an unprecedented bravery of Ukrainians, their stance of the president, their strong resilience, but also a concerted leadership of otherwise fragmented Central Europeans. It is probably for the first time when Central Europeans have decisively been shaping the response of the rest of EU and NATO. Let me mention a few examples. First, shipments of weapons. A few days after the war broke out, Russians have warned the West that any kind of shipments would be considered as escalation that would be unacceptable. Well, the Central Europeans took a geopolitical gamble and they broke a taboo. Soon, France, Germany, and the rest of Europe joined. Consequently, it has become a policy of NATO and EU. It was Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Baltic countries who first went into Ukraine, and it has become the policy of EU and NATO as a consequence. Number 2, another taboo that was crossed thanks to the Central European leadership was granting a status of a candidate for the EU membership to Ukraine. Just a few weeks before, it was a utopia, and in the eyes of many European political leaders, an unacceptable political move to grant the status to a country at war. But however, under the pressure of Central Europeans, also Ukraine is now a candidate country to the membership and starts to negotiate this year. And the third, let me mention the third, very concrete example of the Central European leadership was when the Czech, Slovene, and the Polish leaders at the very beginning stood up and they traveled to Kiev to show support to the Ukrainians. I remember how criticized they were from the Western European countries that this is an unacceptable political move that would drag us into the war. Actually, it has become a common policy of the EU and NATO. Every leader now goes to Ukraine. So this is the rebel and the bravery of Central Europeans who have shown many times the path for the EU and NATO. So without any further ado, I would like to turn to Teresa. And I would like to ask you, this extraordinary geopolitical position where we see Europe now, we haven't seen it before. Is it an exception, or can Central Europe or Europe build on it? Are we seeing a transformation of Europe in the face of war? And will we see Europe more stronger in the future as a consequence?
Well, thank you so much. I first want to say thank you to the organizers of this conference, and also thank you for the audience for being here. I'm so honored to see so many people on the third day at a 5:15 panel. I'm so delighted that you're interested in these issues in Europe, because I think they're so key and so important to us. To quote Vladimir Lenin, there are decades, whoa, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. And there are some days I feel like I'm a fifth Beatle, walking over the wrong words. Let's remember how far we've traveled. Back in 2003, President Jacques Chirac said to leaders of Central and Eastern Europe that they had missed their opportunity to remain quiet. But we see now, picking up on the lighthouse theme, Central and Eastern Europeans actually were a lighthouse on the crisis in Ukraine, and they have done an amazing job in trying to kind of focus the attention of Europe. I think all of Europe is now on the same page, but it wasn't like that initially. There was kind of a paralysis that took place. But let's keep in mind, how Europe used to be described as Americans are from Mars and Europeans are from Venus. Europe always seems to improve itself when there is a crisis. They come together during a crisis. And we've seen some incredible changes that no one had ever dreamed would happen in such a short period of time. The European Peace Facility is one of these new inventions that has come to help support Ukraine under an umbrella for all EU member states, and this kind of joint procurement. Who would have ever dreamt that a peace facility would be used by 1 billion euro has been pledged by artillery shells to help support Ukraine. So I think that this is a very, very important change. And the High Representative Joseph Borrell said, now that something like this has happened and there's been agreement, this is going to stay. It's not going to be rolled back after the war. So I would say that I see three major trends. Hello? And I know I only have 5 minutes, so I'll try to keep it really brief, and we'll get more later. Okay. So in the early days, Europe always used the excuse, we don't do geopolitics. Whenever there was a problem, it was like, we don't do geopolitics. So that we see them now as a geopolitical actor. Under Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, they do geopolitics. Now, when you go from we don't do geopolitics to we do geopolitics, you really need to work on some geopolitical muscle. But I think everyone is coming together, and we have to look at the glass as half full, not half empty. So I think that this is a very positive trend. The second trend, I would say, is because of Sweden and Finland's desire to join NATO, we're seeing more EU member states join NATO, so it's becoming a stronger transatlantic alliance. And we've even seen European leaders say, without the initial US leadership, Europe really would have been in a bind. So they understood that together, the transatlantic alliance can do far more than having the narrative that NATO is brain dead, which President Macron said just 2 years ago. So now we see that Europe is really coming together, and I live in Brussels now for 15 years. NATO and the EU are like two elephants in the city, and they barely spoke to each other. Now we see much more coordination, cooperation, and dialogue. This is an area that needs to improve. It's not perfect yet, but NATO understands that there are certain things they can't do that Europe can do, especially in the economic realm and investment in infrastructure, for example, across the board. So I think that this growing cooperation between NATO and the EU is a very positive sign. And we should also keep in mind the IP4, the Indo-Pacific 4, which came to the NATO summit. So it's not just NATO transatlantic relations getting stronger, but EU, NATO, but also connections to Asia. With the IP4, we had Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea attend the NATO summit. So I think that people see a far bigger geopolitical landscape and picture. And thirdly, since I am here in India, and I've been listening to the conversations, and I understand there's a real concern about Europe's focus on Ukraine. But there's a paradox here, because the more Europe pays attention to Ukraine, we see a lot more engagement in regard to the Indo-Pacific and discussions about what will happen possibly to Taiwan should, God forbid, there be a war in the Taiwan Strait. So you have European officials, you have members of the European Parliament traveling to Taiwan, talking about it, taking a far stronger stand than they ever did in the past. And I think that these are very important developments. So instead of thinking that this is taking away from the bandwidth, that India wants people to focus more on other threats, this is actually a positive feedback loop. Europe is really paying far more attention. But looking forward now, we have to remember what happened at the Munich Security Conference about 2 weeks ago. Wang Yi stood before everyone and kind of spun the special peace plan that China had for Ukraine, the 12-point. It's really just a policy statement. It's not really a peace plan. But anyway, China is now trying to rebrand themselves as a mediator, as a possible peace broker in this region. This started way back in March when Joseph Borrell said the only mediator can be China. I don't know if that was such a great decision, but now China has picked up the lead on that, and on the one-year anniversary, they say they want to maybe do something. So looking ahead, we see what I call reverse armchair Kissingers, people who think that they can drive a wedge between Russia and China. President Macron said he will travel to Beijing to discuss Beijing's peace initiative. I'm a little bit concerned about the timing of all of this. The other thing that China has to do is the European piggy bank. All the technology that is being blocked by the US, they need to have a charm offensive in order to get it from Europe. So we have to stand united on these issues. And then, as Tim Snyder, the historian, great historian on Ukraine and Russia, has stated, Russia's biggest fear is not really the US at all. It's China, and it's such a deep fear that they're even afraid to articulate that. So picking up on the lighthouse to close with the lighthouse theme, Raisina's theme of a lighthouse, we must remember that Central Eastern Europe is the lighthouse who kind of really showed the light on the dangers with Russia, but also that Russia is the storm, but China is the climate change. So thank you.
No. Thank you very much. You described it very nicely since 2014 to 22, when Jacques Chirac said that you missed your opportunity to keep quiet as Eastern Europe, and now really Eastern Europe is shaping the response. So that was a very nice comparison. But let me turn to Shashi Tharoor. Last year on the GlobSec Forum in Bratislava, the Foreign Minister Jai Shankar said, and the video was followed by hundreds of millions of people across the world. He said that, and it was in May, a few months after the war started, and he said that Europe needs to wake up because Europe really thinks that Europe problems are world's problems, but the world problems are not always Europe problems. Do you agree with this, and do you see this war in Ukraine as a transformational war, or is it a local war in Europe? What is at stake for India and globally?
Well, you know, those remarks certainly were greeted with a lot of approbation, a lot of interest and a lot of approbation in India and in many other countries, simply as a wake-up call, as you rightly implied. But it was interesting that at the start of the Raisina dialogue this year, the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, responded very specifically to that comment, and she said two things that struck home as well. The first was that when the sovereignty of a member state of the United Nations is violated and its borders are crossed over, that's not just Europe's problem. And the second thing she said was that, in any case, given the impact of the war on the world, Europe's problems have become the world's problems. And in fact, I was digging up some figures on this, and if you look at the extraordinary consequences for the whole world of this war, they've been truly calamitous. I mean, Russia and Ukraine used to export more than 1/3 of the world's wheat and barley, but 70% of our sunflower oil came from Ukraine, as an Indian. We found that about 20 million tons of Ukrainian grain couldn't get out to other countries. And Ukraine and Russia used to export about 6 million tons of agricultural commodities a month to Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. By June of 2022, that number had come down by 4/5. It was a fraction of what it should be. The World Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, FAO, estimated that global food prices rose 20% because of the war. And the consequence is that in places in Africa and elsewhere, the malnourished population is going to be rising from between 7.6 to 13.1 million children who will not have enough to eat because of this blessed war that in theory has nothing to do with them. It's on a different continent, but they're the ones who are also going to be suffering. You've seen in our own subcontinent the impact on the economies of Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and so on, of the crisis in fuel prices, commodity prices, all of that. So for us to pretend that all of this is something we can afford to ignore is not an option. The war in Europe has affected the rest of the world, and it's hurt the world in very tangible, measurable, quantifiable ways. Now, I think what Mr. Jayashankar was alluding to was a slightly different aspect, which is that, say, when India's borders were violated with impunity, whether by our friends in the north from China, or whether it was the terrorists coming across the borders from Pakistan, that Europe behaved as if that was India's problem. There was no great solidarity expressed. But when a European border is violated, the expectation seems to be that the rest of the world should be concerned. I think that was his concern. I shouldn't be speaking for him, I'm in the opposition, but I think the point he was trying to make was about double standards. And I think double standards are something we should all be conscious of in this kind of dialogue. But if you were to look, strictly speaking, at the question, the second question as to whether this is just a local war, it is and it isn't. It's local in the literal sense that the damage and destruction is essentially in one place, Ukraine. And perhaps, according to the Russians, now more and more in their country and the side of the border as well. But the rest of the world, if not physically affected, has been affected in all these measurable ways. And the rest of the world also is reeling from the various other economic effects. You have sanctions, the things you can't sell, those countries that have trade relations where the Russians have had to scramble to find other outlets, those of us who used to import things that are no longer so easy to import, prices that have gone up, all sorts of essential items. So ultimately, any war that has global consequences cannot be treated as a purely European problem.
Thank you. Let me follow up on what you said, and also following up on yesterday's visit of Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, who was here and who was speaking. India stance towards the war in Ukraine, or the Russian aggression, was not very strong and clear, condemning the Russian aggression because of historic ties, economic ties, etc. Do you see this war changing that relationship in a mid or long term? Will it have some kind of impact to your relationships with Russia?
Well, I was the only member of parliament to actually speak against the Indian position in parliament because I felt that we had let down a number of the principles that we've always stood for since independence, especially in our first few statements at the UN. The first 2 or 3 speeches, we didn't mention sovereignty of a member state, we didn't mention the inviolability of borders, we didn't mention the word invasion or the word war, we didn't talk about the inadmissibility of the use of force to settle international disputes. Now, all of these things are things we have said time and time again on every conflict for the last 75 years, and suddenly we didn't say it, and that I thought was an abandonment of principle. I'm pleased to say that India's position did evolve to the point where these principles are now being advocated regularly by India. Why was India reluctant to take a stand against Russia? I'd say there was some practical politics involved. India's had a long relationship with Russia, and before that the Soviet Union, which was a strong backer of India on issues that mattered to us. Kashmir at the Security Council, for example. The Russians often protected us against hostile action by other powers. There's a long series of IOUs there. There's a defense relationship. The Russians are prepared to sell us weaponry that the West was not in the 60s and 70s. And so that weaponry now at one point at peak was 85% of all of India's defense equipment. Now it's come down to about 45% because India has been diversifying. We get arms from Israel, America, France, and so on. But the fact is that 45% is still a lot, and what exists needs to be serviced, needs to be repaired, needs maintenance, needs parts. So you don't suddenly disrupt your relationship with a supplier of all those essential things. There's also, of course, importance in terms of imports of some oil, gas, fertilizers, other commodities. So it's a relationship with some substance that India did not want to lightly dismiss by completely taking a hostile stand. That much I can understand, but I do believe we could have told the Russians where we stood, and it was interesting that finally Prime Minister Modi in Samarkand said directly in front of the world's cameras, "This is not an era for war, Mr. President," which is as clear a message. And as recently as November, Jaishankar, the foreign minister, was in Moscow, and he kept talking about the vital importance of peace and dialogue and so on. So I'd say that India in its own way is pushing for a solution. But when you say, what does this imply? I think that over time there will certainly be some problems for the Russians. The longer this war goes on, its capacity, for example, to be a reliable supplier of defense equipment, spares, and so on, will be degraded. Already, a lot of their military production has been affected by the war. They need to produce things for their own armed forces, whose tanks and artillery and weaponry are being assaulted and bombarded and defeated in many battles with Ukraine. On top of that, you've got the situation where the Russians themselves can't get a lot of essential supplies, semiconductor chips, for example, so essential for manufacturing. With the result that you're in a situation where I'm afraid Russia is becoming more and more dependent on China. And for India, over time, how useful is a friend and partner who is most dependent, or more dependent anyway, on your principal adversary? And China has killed 20 of our soldiers on the borders just 2 years ago. We can't forget that so quickly, 2.5 years ago. So in these circumstances, a Russia that is China dependent, or that looks more and more like a junior partner of China, is much less useful to India than perhaps the Russia that embarked on this war was. So I think there will again be a gradual downgrading of the relationship for that practical reason. Meantime, oil and fertilizer sales are continuing. The Russians offer us a discount. It's about 30%. But a 30% discount on oil that's 60% more expensive because of the war is not such a great deal. And then on top of that, we are looking at some of the diplomatic conversations going on around. I think there's a clear sign that India does not want to be seen as taking sides against Russia, but nor is it in any way conveying support or even condoning the war. It's accepting it as a reality, that it doesn't feel right now it can afford to disapprove. As I said, as an individual member of parliament, I would have had a slightly different point of view.
Thank you very much. Very interesting perspectives on how this relationship is evolving. And when we are talking about Russia and what Sergei Lavrov said yesterday here, let me turn to Rastislav Kačer. Minister, you have served for Slovakia for over 3 decades in different positions. You were the Deputy Minister of Defense, you were Ambassador to US in many other positions. You've seen country entering NATO. But then you're hearing yesterday Sergei Lavrov saying that they had some kind of promise in the 90s that NATO would not expand and that the Central European countries cannot join NATO or other institutions. That it should be Moscow who can decide whether countries like Slovakia, Czech Republic, or somebody else can only join if they agree. This is, I believe, and I strongly feel that this is a complete denial of our sovereignty and sovereign choices. And this is a complete opposite to an international system which is based on free countries. This is a system which Russia wants to impose, where it has veto right over neighboring countries, and only they can decide what the country can or cannot do. And I think this is a principal battle of the very basics of the international order. So how do you feel about that, and what is at stake?
Well, I was laughing when he said that, because that promise was never delivered, and he used as a reference the most curious thing. He said that I think French ambassador in Israel said during some conference that this was a promise. I say, well, thank you for the reference. I served at NATO in the early 90s, and I can say that there was never a promise like that. And we need to say, and here's my colleague with whom we were fighting for NATO, Minister Korczok, we spent 11 years in getting Slovakia into NATO. So in all of that rubbish saying that NATO is pushing eastward, NATO was never pushing anywhere. To us, this was a horrible process of applying, fulfilling conditions and going around and lobbying for the enlargement and ratification. And it took us 11 years. NATO was never pushing to us. We were, I dare to say, begging on our knees to get there. So it's first thing. Second thing, well, probably I come from an environment where I want to choose with whom I want to live and who I want to like and who I want to love. And I think this is a universal principle at the end, and it's part of the charter. And Czechoslovakia has got experience what it meant to be when power politics was played. In Yalta divided the world into power zones and the sphere of interest, and we paid dear toll for that because Czechoslovakia in 1945 or 1946, before Yalta, was probably somewhere around 9th or 10th most developed and industrial country in the world. And we ended up in 89 after the fall of Soviet Empire as a 66. Well, congratulations on a choice like this. So I think it's part of the charter, it's the law, and it's a fundamental principles that countries are free to choose their allies, their partners, and their future. So if we would accept this logic, what he was saying, we would not shoot one leg, we would shoot both of our legs, and instead of Russian roulette, you know, in a 6-cylinder put 1 bullet, we would put 5 bullets. Well, congratulations on that.
With that, let me turn to your colleague. I know you served together in the US, right? You were colleagues.
No, in Budapest.
Oh, in Budapest, okay. So, but anyway, you were colleagues as ambassadors. And Gordon, we've been talking about how Central Europe has been, shaping the response of EU and NATO with the very brave steps that we've done in the very early stages. Croatia was part of that. And we are often saying that simply Ukraine, with its fight, it's not only defending itself, its sovereignty, but it's defending Europe as well, the very basic principles of the European order. So with what the Foreign Minister Jaishankar said last year, that Europe's problems versus global problems, what is at stake here? How do you see it from Croatia?
Yeah, first of all, accept my apologies for being late, but is it justified, however? Yeah, it is true that in the war Ukraine does not affect all countries in the world, and in the same way individually. We understand, of course, that not all countries see the war in Ukraine as we do. It is because of the geopolitical situation, differences, historical experience, and others. We respect it, of course. But, however, Russian army invaded Ukraine, and then not the other way around. Nothing can hide this obvious fact. In this war, the only side, there's only side we can stand on, the side protecting the rights of the countries to defend itself. And of course, we have to support, it's our duty to support this just natural cause. Of course, Russian aggression has serious global consequences, negative implications. First of all, it has weakened global rule-based order. Second, it has made security environment much less predictable, and it has led to a global polarization when we need more cooperation to get against, more when we need collaboration the most. Today we see that global arms race and erosion of the nuclear security order. We see also the less so-called win-win logic and more competition, competition for resources. And we see the threats also coming from state and not state actors, who just see the absence of rules as an opportunity. And all this means that the country around the world will invest more in security and will have less time and resources just not to deal with other crises and challenges. However, the Russian aggression and the war in Ukraine will have a continued global economic impact, first of all with high inflation, shortages of key materials, raw materials, and of course disrupted and supply channels. And also this Russian aggression has worsened as well the global food security crisis. And of course it is very important just not to have a look at that. It is not just about the fact that getting the existing grains out of Ukraine. In fact, the Russian aggression will limit the capacity of Ukraine to produce grain in future. And it has led to more hunger, to more conflict in the countries, in the poorest countries all the world. And it has led also to the illegal migration and terrorism, and both are threats, global threats. And we are really worried about it. And we have to discuss with them, with our global partners, and precisely because this affects all of us. Croatia understands this aggression very well. 30 years ago, we had this similar situation, and Croatia was a victim of the aggression. So for the very beginning, Croatia shows its solidarity and helped economically, helped financially and militarily and diplomatically. And we offer our experience when it comes to mining and when it comes to the peaceful integration of the former occupied territories. But of course, we have the still occupied territories in Ukraine. And it is important to say that, of course, we understand also the position of others, but we should just to act together unanimous, just to make pressure on Russia. What Russia started the war, and it's only Russia to stop the war and to remove from occupied territories of Ukraine.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and I will come back to it because we have especially, please. We have especially very strong unity in the West that we have built, unprecedented unity. And the question is, how long can we keep it? Because this war has more front lines. This war doesn't have only one front line that is in Ukraine. Another front line of the same war is in energy sector in Europe. Without no doubt, Russia has launched an energy war on Europe. The same goes in the economic sphere. We are seeing increased inflation and economic impacts around the world. And the third front line of the same war is the disinformation space inside of our societies. It's the same war that is fought by different means. So paradoxically, we have to win at home to be able to help Ukraine to win this battle, and we have to win several fronts in long term. And how to do it, it's where to go from here. But before I come back to this question, I would like to ask and enlarge the discussion on China as well. So Alica, what do you expect China, how will it perform regarding this Russian war against Ukraine? And how do you think it will factor in the war in Ukraine in its future calculations, for example, towards Taiwan?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the organizers for allowing us to have this space to express our positions. In terms of Taiwan and China, we had a long panel, but I will come from the position of somebody who is based in Central Eastern Europe and experience the evolution of China's engagement with the region. Obviously, it came with also a 12-point plan at the Business Forum in Budapest to provide investments, and then it became like a major setup for 16+1 and then 17+1 platform with Central and Eastern European countries with lots of investment promises, but we've seen withdrawals. We've seen withdrawals from the Baltic states, and also obviously Czech Republic and Slovakia now going through a lot of reassessments in terms of tangible outcomes of these promises. We know in Czech Republic we had very pro-Chinese president. Now we have a new change of guards with more pragmatic and self-reflective government that does want to uphold values that we stand for. And I heard here before that, you know, even from Lavrov, that we are influenced by the United States, but we've mentioned here before, we are from former Czechoslovakia, where we had to experience all this reform towards democratization, and we did it the hard way. We had to really work hard to get into NATO and EU, and we know exactly every step what it requires. And so we are understanding of Ukraine without being told to support them, because we know what it feels like to fight for the freedoms of expression, of your identity, and so forth. So for China to come to Ukraine with an investment plan, and a few years ago there were very bold plans to help rebuild subway line in Kiev, ports in Mariupol as well, 5G line. Zelensky had bold statements about this with presidency. But I think in early stages he was quite pleased that China didn't get too involved, especially with providing weapons openly to Russia, because I think that would be a big issue for him. He was actually making statements in May last year. I'm glad China is more distant, because that means they're not really arming Russia. But we're no longer so sure, because we're over a year in, and this new peace plan is really just a few statements. As Teresa pointed out, it's some kind of position paper. It really does not give us the bold answer where China stands in upholding the principles, but not just of the United Nations or international law, but also of the Shanghai spirit that is there in the SCO, which clearly states you should not rearm, have a military advantage, you should not destabilize and use force, or disrupt the territorial integrity of another state. So we do expect that if China is noticing Ukraine, that they learn lessons how the international community would respond if there is a case of Taiwan. I think the response would be very coordinated at this stage, because it's not just from the United States anymore in terms of upholding principles, but also I think if they want to be taken seriously, they should be more critical and upholding the Shanghai principles in full length, not just on a piece of paper. Going forward, as was mentioned before, I do not personally anticipate that they unwisely would rush into military invasion of Taiwan. I think they close the gap militarily. They have the capabilities. I think they are resorting to harassment. They are probably going to use more tactics in terms of influencing elections and using, as you mentioned before, misinformation campaigns. and maybe some cyber attacks. And I think another one is undermining the resistance of Taiwanese people to uphold their own freedoms of operations and presence in the world. And I think this is our role from Europe, even though German representative before said we can't do much in Indo-Pacific, but we can definitely provide a moral support and help with countering these operations even in Europe, because they are existing, they are happening from Russia and China, they are documented. And I think this is a full-scale global situation. This is not just a regional conflict. This really has impacts on the global way we conduct our affairs. So I would just say, final comment, which was amusing to me from that speech from Lavrov, was the suggestion of this unilateral India, China, and Russia trio that they should revive and work on. I think there is so much mistrust in that relationship that it's fruitless to actually even suggest it at this stage. And I think I don't understand why we don't take the time to answer the real questions that were asked of him. I don't think he really addressed these questions, and he was given a space. So I would say with China and Ukraine, I would imagine that they will try to be more bold and uphold the principles even of the Shanghai spirit or BRICS spirit of not resorting to disruption of territorial integrity of another country.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting, and I would have several follow-up questions to everything what you said, but we started late. We were giving 10 minutes less, so give me just 1-2 minutes for quick reactions. I know there are questions as well, but probably we can't do everything. But there are increasing or few opinions in US that the war in Ukraine is just a distraction from the main focus or the main adversary of the US, which is China. And it is decreasing focus from the main strategic long-term thing. But what message would we send to China if we, after 1 year, back off from Ukraine? What message would it say to any other future aggressors? That's what we can do, actually only 1 year, and then we push the country that was attacked into some kind of compromise. I think it would not be the right message. But I've seen all of you, Rashi, saw that you wanted to react. So please, if you can have last word also, Shashi. Teresa.
Very quick, I enjoyed that comment on this coalition of three, where nobody trusts the other one. It would be the most weird coalition and most unnatural. But just a quick comment, if this was a distraction from a real problem of China, and if China was able to make Russia to do this lunacy and shoot both of their legs and then complain that they cannot walk, then it would be extremely skilled intelligence or diplomatic operation by China, and I congratulate on that. But truth is that what Russia is doing, it completely doesn't make sense. It's so irrational because it doesn't make them stronger. It makes them much weaker. It makes Europe temporarily weaker, but we will catch up. We will accommodate. And at the beginning you said, will Europe be stronger after this crisis? Every individual crisis and every large crisis is an opportunity to become stronger. And I trust Europe will come stronger, and it's already all signs. We are coming stronger. Even overall goodwill community, where I include very much India, will become stronger. So at the end, congratulations to this. When Russia is weaker, we will become strong again, but probably the only victories will be China, where the fruit will be lowered down for easier pickup. But I think international community is strong enough to cope with this challenge. We learned the lesson of strategic dependencies, and we will continue in that, also in relation to China, it's clear.
Thank you, Shashi.
Well, I mean, you remember Napoleon's crack, or was it Voltaire's, about the Holy Roman Empire? There was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. The Chinese peace plan, not much of a plan. There's no real prospects of peace in it, and I wonder how Chinese it is, because it really seems to be full of platitudes that could have been prepared in Moscow. So objectively, there is a case for peace. India has also been trying to make one. But I'm not quite sure if China is going to be a credible agent for it, especially the way it's behaved in the course of the war. But also, frankly, I'm not sure either side at the moment is ready for peace. They both seem to think they can, quote unquote, win whatever winning is all about. And at this stage, it's far from clear that we are going to see a swift end to this nasty conflict. If anything, the worry is that it's going to be prolonged and even more of a stalemate with these continuing consequences for the rest of the world. So it's with each passing month, it's going to be more urgent for all of us to see this come to an end. But in the meantime, it suits some people's interests to have it continue. I'm sure the arms merchants are singing all the way to the bank, and we've certainly seen some people in Russia doing rather well out of all of this, and we're seeing in some other countries. I mean, I must admit that India is refining a bit of the Russian oil and selling it off to UK and US, and you have to ask yourself, what does that imply? So I think rather than getting adjusted to the new normal, we do need peace, but I don't think the Chinese way is the way forward.
Yeah. There is a last word, if you want.
Oh my goodness. Okay, thank you so much. I was just thinking, you know, Europe, people have accused it of taking a holiday from history. We've seen how fast they've just run down the armaments. They don't even have artillery shells. So I think that this has been a huge wake-up call. As Benjamin Franklin said, if by failing to prepare, we are preparing to fail. And I think that we really need to see cooperation among all like-minded parties, that this could possibly, in a worst-case scenario, turn into a proxy war, something similar to what happened in the Korean War. So I think I'm grateful to Raisina for convening all of us together, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you next year. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and with that I would like to thank to the panelists, and as you've seen, we brought more Central Europe here to Raisina. We will be continuing in Bratislava at the Globsec Forum because we want to bring more India to Central Europe because we feel that these relationships are very, very, very important for the future. So congratulations to organizers, and let's continue on also the forums in Bratislava.
Okay.
You have two
I have
fingers.
2 seconds. I'm sorry, I missed my final point. If we look at the peace, the so-called policy statement on crisis in Ukraine that the PRC published, they have 12 points, and the 12th point is kind of an advertisement saying, don't forget us, we will help you rebuild Ukraine. So I would suggest that India also join and help rebuild Ukraine, and this could create wonderful areas of cooperation with Europe as well. So I think that this is something we should all think about.
And we can be your gateway, definitely.